Welcome to Around the Empire. I'm your host, Joanne Leon. Around the Empire podcast, listener-supported independent media. Pitch in if you can, patreon.com/aroundtheempire, paypal.me/aroundtheempirepod. Also, please like, share, and subscribe on YouTube. Today, we talk with Jennifer Pan and Alexandra Siegel, and we talk about their research paper titled How Saudi Crackdowns Failed to Silence Online Dissent, which was published in the American Political Science Review. They studied the effects of well-known Saudi activists, religious leaders, and journalists being imprisoned for online dissent. They analyzed tweets and Google search data from the years 2010 to 2017 using automated analysis of text and crowdsourced human evaluation of content to draw conclusions about the behavior of their peers and their followers. And their research showed that it did not suppress online dissent overall. Jennifer Pan is an assistant professor in the Department of Communications at Stanford University. Her research focuses on political communication and authoritarian politics, political censorship, propaganda, and information manipulation in the digital age. She uses experimental and computational methods with large-scale data sets on political activity in China and other countries. Alexandra Siegel is a postdoctoral fellow at Stanford University and a research associate at NYU. And in her research, she studies mass and elite political behavior in the Arab world, including intergroup conflict, extremism, and disinformation. And her analysis involves large data sets from social media, text and networks, and machine learning methods and experiments. Jennifer Pan and Alexandra Siegel are here, speaking to us from California. Hello, Jennifer, and hello, Alexandra. Thanks so much for coming on the show, and it's great to meet you.
Thanks so much for having us.
Great to be here.
So we're here because I came across an academic research paper titled How Saudi Crackdowns Failed to Silence Online Dissent, and it was published in the American Political Science Review, and I found it really interesting for a lot of reasons. This audience is generally a war and foreign policy audience. It is about 60 to 70% domestic, and it depends on the episode. It can be anywhere from half to 30 to 20% international. So we're all interested in this, but I have a tech background, so I'm also interested in the techniques that you used and the things that are that we're able to do, and that aspect of it too. So I will, I'll throw a little bit of that into it because I think it's interesting for everybody, frankly. But let's just start. I think we should probably just dig into, maybe give us a little bit about your background and how this project came about, how this get started. And then we'll dig into the details of what the questions were and what you found and how you did it.
Sounds great. Wait, Alex, do you want to start?
Sure. So my name's Alexandra Siegel, and I'm a postdoctoral researcher at Stanford, and Jen Pan is an assistant professor at Stanford. And really the way this came about is we were both interested in this kind of global rise of governments responding to online dissent with physical repression, things like arrests and even torturing and killing citizens for their online activity. And we've seen this happen not only in kind of authoritarian regimes like Russia, China, and Iran, but even in democratic contexts as well, like Mexico and Lebanon. And so we were interested in studying this phenomenon of how government's physical repression impacts online dissent or online speech more generally. And we decided to study this in the Saudi context, since it's an environment where we've seen a growing rise in the regime arresting and even torturing people as a consequence of their online speech.
Yeah, and just a little bit more context. So Alex and I met before she was at Stanford, when she was still doing her PhD at NYU. I was an assistant professor at Stanford, and I'm right now at Stanford in the communication department. But we both were part of this social media and political participation group that comes out of NYU. And I had previously done research on censorship and propaganda in China, but mostly looking at kind of online censorship and online propaganda. And it was at one of these meetings when, Alex, I think you were talking about Saudi Arabia, and I had been noticing that China was no longer just using online tactics to try to suppress online speech. And I think, Alex, you mentioned something similar happening in the Middle East. And so that's kind of how the collaboration first started.
Right. So this question, let's talk about what your questions were and then how you went about doing it. So you've already hinted at that, but lay out, what you were attempting to study here.
First, we're noticing that all around the world, governments were using these sorts of arrests, torture, killings, targeted at people who had large online followings. And so what we wanted to know was, what happens when you suppress someone with physical repression? What happens to their online presence? Obviously, if they're in prison, they can't speak. But if they're released, what happens afterwards? And what happens to their followers? So that's really the question that we set out to answer. And then how do we get data around that? We looked for countries where this was happening, where there was accessible data. And in our case, Twitter data was accessible. But for example, in China, where this is happening, Weibo data was much less accessible.
And in thinking about studying this in the Saudi context, Saudi Arabia has one of the highest levels of Twitter penetration in the world. And normally when we think about Twitter, we think it's only young people, so it's probably only capturing a small part of the population. But in the Saudi context, we have 70% of the population that's under 30. There's this giant youth bulge. And because the regime had invested really heavily in mobile broadband penetration, lots and lots of people are online on social media platforms like Twitter. So in some ways, it's an ideal setting to try to study this from a data standpoint, since we have access to such a large chunk of the population.
Yeah, that is really curious. And I noticed one time on Periscope, I was looking, they have this map and you can see like where most people are where all the Periscope videos are coming from, which I just found to be interesting just on the face of it. And when I was scrolling across the map, into other parts of the world, it was noticeable that there was so much more activity in Saudi Arabia. And I thought, that's not what I expected at all. So you're saying part of the reason is that the way they built out their mobile, their telecom, basically. But I mean, it seems to be the opposite of what we would expect. Why are they so free with the use of social media? Is it a surveillance tool? Is it, they use the trade-off because they were able to watch their own population? Do they just not know how to get a hold of it? Because, I mean, they're historically a very repressive royal monarchy. So what do you think about that, or what have you found?
Right. So what's interesting is the fact that the use of these tools for political purposes kind of took the regime by surprise initially. So before the Arab Spring, these tools were starting to become quite popular, but we had a bunch of monarchs in their 70s and 80s who kind of didn't get the way that these tools might be used in a manner that could be threatening to them. And so by the time the Arab Spring happened and the regime kind of realized the need to control these online spaces, the cat was sort of out of the bag. And Jen can speak to this more, but this is very much in contrast to somewhere like China, where the regime actually built some of its own social media platforms and tools that it was then able to control much more directly. Whereas here we have Saudi citizens using these Western platforms that make it very difficult for the regime to control content in these spaces.
I think the other thing to keep in mind is that most people, whether in the US or around the world, are not interested in politics. So for the most part, people are not using social media for political reasons. And I think that's one of the ways that governments can be caught off guard. Because for the most part, it's not a political tool. But then when the political side of it emerges, it's often a surprise.
Yeah. Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
Oh, yeah. And just as you mentioned, also, I mean, now we see the regime very much trying to use these tools for their own purposes as well, whether it be surveillance or creating kind of bot and troll armies or other computational propaganda techniques to try to flood the platforms with their messages. But in the period that Jen and I were looking at, this was sort of less the case.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought that up because that was going to be one of my questions. My IT background's been mostly in application development. So I'm dealing with people and the systems they need and building the front end and the back end of how to do that. And, you know, uh, people can be a pain to work with, but our work always involved data. And some of my work involved just data modeling, things like that. But most of the time I was dealing with people. And we used to say things like dealing with data was sort of a relief from dealing with people because we would say data doesn't lie, and not that people lie. It's just, it could be more difficult to deal with people. But the problem is now the data kind of does lie because now we have more deliberate manipulation of social media because it is such a, it's great. We love it, but it's great for people who want to, um, all different kinds of people, but particular people who fear it, governments and authorities who fear it, and also who now they can understand more. It's just data that didn't exist before. So in recent years, now we have, like you said, the bots. You've got influence operations. You've got not that didn't exist before, but it seems to have really expanded. Mm-hmm. And I've actually heard researchers complain about this, like, hey, you're wrecking our work here. We can't give you good answers if you're manipulating the data. So you just halfway answered that. You said that the time period that you used, there was, you think, less manipulation going on. But what are your thoughts on that?
I think the one important thing is that we'd be very unlikely to observe the result that we do find if the government had its way, if it comes to internet online manipulation. So what we find is that those who directly experience imprisonment after their release, they say much less online and they stop being critical of the Saudi regime. But their followers, and specifically people who don't just follow them, but who have engaged with them, who retweeted them, replied to them, mentioned them in the past, become more angry at the regime. And they do not stop engaging in dissent. And so that's, I would say, not the outcome that Saudi Arabia would probably prefer. And if it had successful manipulation, then we shouldn't observe that. So there could be kind of false content in our data, but if it's there, it still doesn't. If anything, then it means the real effect we observe is stronger.
And I think this is partly a function of how we're collecting data. So we're beginning with this known group of people who were arrested for their online speech who have large followings. So we know that those accounts are likely to be authentic. And then when we're looking at followers who over time, both before and after the arrest, have engaged with them online, this is sort of not the type of account that would likely be part of an influence campaign, which often sort of crop up as new accounts or changed accounts, which are, suddenly acting in tandem altogether. So, it's not to say that there might not have been influence campaigns going on surrounding some of the issues we were looking at, but the way we're collecting data also, I think, makes it less likely that such accounts are sort of part of what we're seeing.
Yeah, I mean, influence campaigns internally, but then there's the issue of information war, adversaries, whatever, sowing dissent. We hear that all the time about the fear of other countries sowing dissent. So there's that. I don't know how I don't know how you account for that or how you build that in unless there's a way to identify these. Some people say they can identify, let's say, Russian bots or whatever, but I've never really seen their methods, and they refuse to, reveal the identities of these, bots that they're studying. So I'm not convinced that they really do have a good method for that. But it's, it's curious. It's gonna, it's a real challenge for the work. But so yeah, let's talk about the. I think we understand you were talking about three sets of people, basically the leaders themselves. The second group of people are they like influencers, people who have they follow the person who you're let's not call them a target, your subject, the person who is subject to repression, and then the people who support uh, him or her, and then the third level of people. I'm sorry, I forget the terms that you use. Maybe you could explain those real quick.
Yeah, definitely. So there are three groups. The first are what we call opinion leaders, online opinion leaders, who are themselves arrested. Then the second group, which is a very large group, are individuals who have retweeted, mentioned, replied in the past any of these people who are arrested. And then the third group are other opinion leaders who are not arrested, but who had previously said similar things online as those who were arrested. So this third group are the people who are most likely to be kind of deterred from the arrests, right? Because they are prominent, they have said similar things. And so what we want to see is, does their behavior change even though they don't directly experience that repression?
Right.
Yeah, and in some ways, one of our most interesting findings is that we don't see a change in the behavior of that group of people, these people that are sort of the peers of those who were themselves arrested, who were engaging in similar behavior, who also have these large online followings.
And those are the people that an authoritative government would be authoritarian government would generally be most concerned about, right?
Yes, those who have influence.
Yeah, yeah. So your study, you did not use Facebook, you focused on Twitter and Google searches, right?
Mm-hmm.
Just real curious. If this is a long answer, then just ditch it. But why did you not focus on Facebook?
So this is really just a data availability issue with Facebook data. I suppose we could have looked at public pages if some of these people have public pages, but we wouldn't be able to see the kind of interactions with followers that we can see on Twitter in a public way, just because so much of Facebook data is private and our ability to collect it as researchers kind of keeps getting restricted as the company has turned off some of the API options that used to be available to researchers.
Okay. Got it. Yeah. And Twitter is just more atomized. It's I prefer it myself too, but
I mean, they're different platforms. So when you're on Twitter, you know your tweets are public. Mm-hmm. When you're on Facebook, maybe you feel like your posts are public, but it is still limited to the people that you are friends with. And so, yeah, because of those different expectations, the companies also share data in different ways.
And here we're talking about online dissent, which is a public action. So in some ways, it makes more sense to look at Twitter data because that's more explicitly kind of visible dissent.
Right. Yeah, I didn't think about the fact that, yeah, people have shielded some parts of their content for friends and all that. And then you use Google search data. I didn't even know that Google search data was available, that I could go download someone's search data. Isn't it harder to figure out who they are when they're doing a Google search? Is it identified by their Google ID or how? Oh, that's right. You said you use the Arabic names to figure out. How did you do the Google search research analysis?
Sure. So the idea here is to try to get a sense not of what specific individuals are searching for on Google, but in aggregate, are we seeing basically higher levels of interest in the people who were arrested after their arrest compared to before? Because you might imagine a scenario in which once these people are in jail, people lose interest in them because they're not speaking as much and people don't see them, or that the reverse could be true, that observing these arrests kind of draws interest of the broader population. So what we have in the Google search data is just this aggregate level data of in Saudi Arabia, how much are people searching for these individuals relative to other topics and terms in the pre versus post period.
And I should say that we definitely do not have the Google IDs of anyone.
No.
Google knows where the searches are coming from. And so they aggregate that data, and we're just using that aggregated data. In the Twitter kind of situation, again, we're not told there it's different. We're not told where the data is coming from. And so we're using things like, are they using Arabic? What time zone are they in? Do they turn on location settings? If so, then we can locate their longitude and latitude of their tweets to the region. So we use these various methods on the Twitter data to identify individuals from Saudi Arabia. But with the Google data, that Google has determined where the searches are coming from.
Okay, I misunderstood that. I read this Google search data from the period offers detailed digital footprints of the online activity of these arrested individuals, similar non-arrested individuals, the arrested individuals' followers, and the Saudi public. And so I misread that to think that you could actually zero in on what they search for. So you're talking about, the same kind of thing that Google publishes all the time, like which Democratic candidate was most searched for during, a period of time.
That's right. That's right.
Got it.
And the reason we did this was because initially we didn't know what result we would find. So one result could have been that you have this physical repression and then everyone is suppressed. Those who are arrested don't talk anymore. Their followers don't talk anymore. Other opinion leaders don't talk anymore. And so that's when we would, if we have found that, we would want the search data, because we want to know, are people privately still interested in this, but they're just afraid to speak out? So that's not what we find. And so in some ways, the Google data is not as essential, but that's why we designed the study, to have both the public data and kind of these private searches.
Yeah. That's a more nuanced, conclusions that you can, or, at least theories you can draw from that. I have in my questions here, I have quoted where you say, because individuals conducting Google searches are generally alone and there's no obvious record of their activity, they're more likely to express socially and politically taboo thoughts in their searches than they might in more public forums. So yeah, I guess the search data has more information in it than I even realized, and that's really interesting.
Yeah, no, that's right. But I think the most surprising thing for us is that people publicly don't rein themselves in after these arrests. They keep dissenting, they keep expressing their political views.
Right. So then in practice, we see a really similar pattern in the private searches that we do to the sort of behavior of the engaged followers in the Twitter data.
Yeah. Did you speculate on that? Do you think that they think there's power in numbers? Do you think that the anger and the, frustration is have they been, I guess sometimes people would call this, they've been radicalized to the point where they're willing to take more risks and make more sacrifices. What conclusions or theories did you come up in that arena?
Yeah, so you mentioned risk, and in some ways, I think this idea of risk calculus is really important. So does observing this arrest of a well-known individual change your feelings about the likelihood that you yourself might be personally targeted? And for these followers, these people that aren't that visible online, and there are many, many, many of them, in some cases, millions of them, as you're saying, for these people, continuing to dissent probably doesn't alter their perception of the likelihood that they would themselves be targeted. But it would be interesting to see moving forward, as the regime kind of gets better at surveillance and monitoring of the platforms, if that continues to be the case.
Yeah. With Google searches, I guess the percentages, I was thinking, what if they use DuckDuckGo or Bing or other? I've changed my own online behavior recently. Like I try not to use Google searches anymore. I use DuckDuckGo and all that. But I don't know, maybe those search results are available as well, or maybe they're just negligible and not really that relevant. But people who are worried about repression and about, backlash for their behaviors, they're going to take avoidance. They're going to use techniques to avoid being detected, right? Any thoughts on that?
Well, I think, again, as Jen said, just the fact that we continue to see the level of public dissent that we do implies that, even if some people are taking those measures, there's still lots of people who are publicly expressing their views, which doesn't mean they don't fear a government response, but they think that the expression is, worth it. And perhaps that because there are many people doing this, they won't be personally targeted.
And in this case, Twitter actually protects those people who are using Twitter in Saudi Arabia to a certain extent. If it was a domestic social media company that was run by even a private company that was located in Saudi Arabia, it would be much, much easier for the Saudi government to get the real identifications of the people who are and link them to their Twitter account, to their social media accounts. But the fact that it's Twitter makes it much harder for the Saudi government to say, okay, I know exactly who said this. I know where they live. I know their contact information. And so there is a degree of anonymity that Twitter affords, even though it's public.
Yeah, I haven't really kept up lately on what they've been doing with subpoenas and things like that. But that was, as far as I know, for domestic issues. I'm not sure what they do with other countries.
I don't think you have to use a real ID to register a Twitter account, right? You need to provide some sort of contact information like an email, but you can obtain an email without providing your real name, birth date, etc.
Right. Yeah, I think that is still the case.
So I think the contrast is in China, the Chinese government began requiring use of real identification to register with social media accounts. And because social media companies in China are domestic, they have to comply with those government regulations. And as a result, it becomes much easier for the government to identify exactly who is online and what they're saying.
Right. Also, I was curious about the way that you did your, I think what you call content analysis. You said you did a crowdsourced evaluation of tweet content. We crowdsourced large-scale human coding of tweets via Figure 8, a platform which used to be Crowdflower, a platform similar to Mechanical Turk, but with more native Arabic speakers. You talk just a little bit more out of that, just for people who are interested in the techniques.
Yeah, so this is a platform, if you've heard of mTurk, it's quite similar to that, but the idea is it's this online space where there are crowdsourced tasks, and one of the types of tasks that it's set up really well for is coding of text. So basically, you ask individuals a series of questions about each tweet or post, which they can, like multiple choice questions, which they can then answer. So in this case, this would be things like, does this tweet express a positive, negative, or neutral attitude towards the regime? And we define in detail, what the parameters of that would be for the people completing the tasks. But there are thousands of people on this platform at any time of the day that are getting paid to do these kinds of data enrichment tasks.
Wow, I didn't even know about this. So, these are things where you just need human input. It can't really be done, or at least not yet, through AI or other automated techniques.
Yeah, and this is a place where we could have used machine learning techniques once we had done a certain amount of human coding, but because the issues that we were asking about were quite nuanced and detailed, and because it's relatively inexpensive to get large numbers of people to code the tweets, we thought that this would give us sort of more accurate labels of our data. So basically 3 native speakers coded each tweet along several dimensions.
That's really interesting. Probably a whole lot more people know, but I haven't done a lot with data analysis in recent years, so I'm not familiar with some of the platforms and the different apps and APIs that are available. I talked to you about the communications and social science professionals, like beefing up tech skills, and I guess you've always had to analyze a lot of data. You've always had different tools, but maybe just a couple of minutes on how this field is changing because of the combination of tech and social science skills. Like,
Yeah.
what do you
Yeah.
think is happening with that? That seems like a big deal to me. Maybe I'm just not familiar with the field enough to understand.
From my perspective, it has changed a lot. And in particular, it's changed what we can know about these authoritarian regimes, which are typically very opaque. The government doesn't provide information. It's very hard to do surveys and collect data in more traditional ways. And so, with the advent of social media starting in the late 2000s, it's really given us a new way of studying and understanding these contexts. And I would say now that change is accelerating as more and more of our digital information, as more and more of our activities and behaviors are digitized. Obviously, a lot of that is not publicly available and should not be for privacy reasons, but more is becoming available, especially at the aggregate level, which allows us to understand how individuals, groups, and societies behave in a way that we haven't been able to before.
Yeah, and so then what you're seeing is people like Jen who study China, or most of my work is focused in the Middle East, being able to ask these questions about political behavior and really sensitive political issues in contexts where, as she mentioned, it's impossible to use more traditional approaches. So with this paper, we're studying Saudi Arabia, which there's hardly any social science work and research has been done there simply because it's so challenging to physically go and field a survey or talk to people about sensitive issues. But now we have this kind of digital trace data allowing us to look at these things in new ways.
And just before we wrap up, let's bring it home now, right? So we're also seeing increasing amounts of censorship and repression at home. In the UK, and when I say at home, I'm going to extend that to some of our closest allies. Like for the UK under David Cameron, they really shifted to a focus on how to prevent radicalization, how to preventing the spread of extremism. I guess every government's worried about that, but we also have people being deplatformed or quote unquote canceled or things like that. And I mean, the obvious example here is Julian Assange, right? Now we have him being imprisoned. We have these conditions that you talk about, where it's not just online censorship, it's not just other kinds of repression. Now and Chelsea Manning, and they're in jail, right? And the UN rapporteur on torture considers the treatment of Assange to be qualifies as torture. So, do you think that these same results that you see in more repressive regimes, do you think that they're going to apply at home? Did you even, did you think about that question about, because you did talk a little bit about in democracies. What do you think? What
So
things can you draw from it?
Yeah. So what we know from the research, you mute and I'll answer the previous question. Okay. Where were we?
Oh yeah. So take an example like Julian Assange or Chelsea Manning, and do your results. What do you think? The results that you see in repressive regimes, the more notorious ones, do you think it's going to apply here, or did you even go that far with your questions?
We didn't
I'm
go
sorry
that far
if
with our questions.
if I missed it.
We didn't go that far with our questions, but our research joins a pretty large body of research on censorship, and the findings of all of this research is that almost always censorship backfires. And so that's probably going to be applicable in the US as well. When censorship happens, it often actually attracts interest rather than deters interest. And that interest can often backfire. The only instance, and there's a name for this, which is the Streisand effect.
Right, of course, yeah.
Right. The only instances where censorship seems to be successful is when it happens in a way that's hard for individuals to detect. And we see that in a few instances, but for the most part, when there's censorship, whether it's online or physical repression aimed at censorship, the empirical results from a large number of studies finds that it just doesn't work.
And I'll also just add to that, I think the fact that we observe some degree of backlash, even in this really highly repressive context, when we're looking at the effects of physical repression on online dissent, suggests that we might see them elsewhere as well. But, we hope that more research will look into these patterns in more context beyond just Saudi Arabia.
Yeah, I hope so too. I found it encouraging. How about time frames? Okay, so you were looking at like a 7-year time frame, I think. Mm-hmm. Is there anything from relevant that you found or you could discuss on, how long these things take, or more immediate reactions, or I would think the longer term effects would be more difficult to study. So you were really talking about sort of short and medium term implications. Is that accurate?
Yeah, so basically what we do is we look at the month preceding and following the arrest, or preceding and following the release from, preceding the arrest and then following the release from prison in the case of the people who are themselves arrested, and also the year before and after timeframes to help us kind of tease out these shorter and longer term effects. And in terms of the people who are themselves arrested, we see this chilling effect where they tweet less overall and express less dissent toward the regime, persisting a year out following their releases from prison. With their followers, what we tended to see was a spike around the arrests and then kind of a return to normal levels in terms of the volume of their engagement. But again, we're seeing persistent effects in terms of the content of their tweets a year out.
Yeah. And that's a really interesting results, because even if the people, who are being, who are the direct target of this, even if they quiet down, it doesn't quiet down the broader movement, if you will. And that has so many implications, doesn't it?
Right. Yeah.
Okay. All right. I don't want to keep you any longer. Anything else you want? Maybe we didn't get to it, or just something you'd like to say before we wrap up?
No, thank you so much for having us.
Okay, yeah, great.
Thank you for having us.
Please tell everybody where to find your work and, how to keep up with what you're doing.
So you can find my work on my website at jenpanpan.com.
And you can find my work at alexandra-siegel.com. And also, as Jen mentioned, since we met through our joint work at NYU's Social Media and Political Participation Lab, you can check their work out as well.
Okay, great. Thank you so much. Look forward to talking to you again. Thank you for listening. Special thanks to Jennifer Pan and Alexandra Siegel. Follow Jen on Twitter at JenPan, and find her work at her website, jenpan.com. Follow Alexandra on Twitter at AASiegel, Siegel, and find her work on her website, alexandra-siegel.com. Around the Empire podcast, independent media. Your support's really important. Please pitch in if you can at patreon.com/aroundtheempire or paypal.me/aroundtheempirepod. There are lots of ways to find this podcast and to listen to it. You can find it on any mobile podcast app, or on the website, aroundtheempire.com, or on Patreon, or on YouTube. And if you're listening on YouTube, please like, share, and subscribe. Also follow on Twitter at Around the Empire, and we'll see you next time. Take care, everyone.